name is Gabrielle Stinnett, and I come to present to you music interaction using the three examples from the assignment: medieval church, Lutheran church, and one that kind of is a little far-fetched, but my favorite, jazz club music. Alrighty, so the first example we're going to discuss today is the medieval church music. I have included a photograph of one medieval church that one would have seen, a listener, and you can see very detailed architecture, a really good site to look at, and you can kind of see the style of the time period as well. So the medieval music time period begins with the fall of the Roman Empire and ends approximately around the 15th century, so right before we hit the Renaissance era. Its geographic location is Europe. All right, so I'm going to play like about a minute and 30 seconds of example of medieval music from the era. Right. So as you can see, we witnessed Gregorian chant, which was popular during that time period. The music was really polyphonic, and then I also heard a little bit of monophonic, and then parallel motion. So unlike the Lutheran church, which we'll discuss in a minute, but everything was really about Gregorian chant, really one-toned, but still beautiful. The listeners who engaged in medieval church music were very passive, and they were elite nobility, peasants, middle-aged churchgoers, middle-class churchgoers, I'm sorry. The next example we have is the Lutheran church. So you can kind of see a little bit more modern, yet still very historical. This time period dates back to the 16th century, and just like with the medieval church period, you have the geographic location being Europe as well. I'm going to play a little snippet of What Is This Bread, which is one of my faves. This style of music is really similar to that of the medieval church music, but I hear more of an organ now, and then it's really polyphonic. I see the Gregorian chant that's evident too, but it's more congregational style. But both are similar, but this kind of, Martin Luther wanted more of his music to not so resemble the medieval church period, but he wanted like the poets and the clergy to tailor their hymns and make new hymns, so it could become more congregational style. And they when I was doing research, they called this music Lutheran worship music because it really engaged listeners and allowed listeners to really worship and have their music be directly connected to God. Alrighty, so in our Lutheran church style music, we hear a lot of harmonies. Still, like I said, Gregorian chant, really polyphonic. The type of listeners, we have active listeners. Like I said, Martin Luther really pushed for congregational style singing. So he really, really wanted the hymns to have a wider emotional range. During this time period, there was a war going on. So he really wanted the listeners to really act and engage and connect with the Lord. And this was kind of like therapeutic music. The hymn books contain lyrics, so the audience did know a lot about the song at that time. They knew the lyrics and sung together. Of course, it's a congregation. The elite nobility, peasants, middle class, and churchgoers were listeners of Lutheran church music at the time. And of course, the performances, of course, at a Lutheran church. The style was, like I mentioned, polyphonic. It was a lot of vernacular congregational singing and, like we mentioned, Gregorian melodies. Our very last and my very favorite is the jazz club. I wanted to kind of switch it up a little bit. We went from the church style music to more secular style, which is the jazz club. The time period is more modern, so you have your late 19th century and early 20th century, so about 100 years ago is when it first came to play. The geographic location is New Orleans, and what was really interesting about jazz music is that once a lot of the jazz clubs closed down in New Orleans, a lot of the jazz musicians migrated to Chicago, and so Chicago became a really, really hard-hitting place for jazz music, and it really kind of put the genre on the map. And then it also moved to New York. A lot of jazz musicians and jazz styles were prominent in New York. So I'm going to play and also show you a snippet of a jazz club so you can kind of see how interesting it was on the inside.
Country and city, between black and white, and men and women, between the old Africa and the old Europe, that could only have happened in an entirely new world. It is an improvisational art, making itself up as it goes along, just like the country that gave it birth. It rewards individual expression, but demands selfless collaboration. It is forever changing.
Alrighty, so you can see there was a lot of interaction there among the listeners. So, as you can see in the video, the listeners are really active. They brought the party. So you have your musicians, but then you have your listeners who are oftentimes friends and family of the musicians. They knew the lyrics because jazz was all about improvisation. So the musician may have said, let's go, and then you'll have the dancers and the listeners saying, let's go. So any type of interaction was there. Of course, listeners were members of the general public. You had, I don't want to say peasants, but people more of the lower class. You also had middle class attendees and churchgoers. So it's funny because even in my community, you'll have, the African American community in the church on Sunday, but more than likely they were at the jazz clubs on Saturday night, Friday night, and even Thursday night. So the performances, unlike the Lutheran church and the medieval church, you had your jazz performances in jazz clubs, at festivals, at parades, at funerals, at saloons, and even in dance halls. And I mentioned funerals because that was big where jazz music was played, which was really, really interesting to learn. Like I mentioned, jazz was big on improvisation, the call and response. You had your blue notes, you had your polyrhythms, and you had African-based rhythmic patterns. And that is the end of my presentation. I hope you enjoyed and learned something new. Thank you so much again for tuning in.